October 19th, 2025. Two sisters, ages 8 and 11, stand on a street corner every evening singing their hearts out, collecting spare change to buy their mother's insulin, a medication they can barely afford on their own. When a wealthy businessman stops to listen, he's moved to tears. But what happens next isn't just charity. It's a wake-up call that exposes a broken system. But here's the question everyone asks. How can two children become the face of a national crisis that forces politicians and corporations to finally take action? The evening air was cool, carrying the first hints of autumn as pedestrians hurried through downtown with their heads down, focused on getting home. The street corner near 5th and Madison had been transformed into an impromptu stage. A worn cardboard box served as a tip jar, and standing in front of it were two girls who had no business being there at all. Grace was 11, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that held a responsibility no child should carry. Beside her stood her younger sister, Emma, just 8 years old, with the kind of fragile frame that suggested she didn't get enough to eat. Both wore clean but faded clothes, their shoes scuffed from months of wear. They began to sing. The melody that emerged was Hallelujah. Not the rock version most people knew, but an arrangement so pure and heartfelt that it seemed to reach into the chest of anyone who paused to listen. Grace's voice carried the main melody with surprising control for a girl her age, while Emma's higher register wove through underneath like a thread of silver. Their harmonies were imperfect in the way that only real emotion can be, not polished but genuine. Most passers-by didn't stop. They glanced, maybe dropped $1 if they felt particularly generous, and moved on. But a few, particularly older people or parents with children, would linger. Some had tears in their eyes by the time the song ended. This happened every evening, Monday through Saturday, from 6 o'clock until around 8. The girls never missed a night, regardless of weather. During the summer heat, they stood under the scorching sun, their voices growing hoarse. When it rained, they huddled under a small umbrella Grace had learned to balance while singing. Now, as the temperature dropped toward the end of September, they wore light jackets that provided minimal protection from the chill. 3 blocks away, in a modest 2-bedroom apartment that took up half their monthly budget, their mother lay in bed. Jennifer Foster was 42 years old, though she looked 15 years older. Type 1 diabetes had ravaged her body over the past 5 years, ever since her husband had abandoned the family without warning or financial support. She had worked as a nurse before the disease progressed, before her vision started to fail, before the complications made it impossible to stand for 8-hour shifts. Now she managed her condition as best she could on the disability payments that barely covered rent. The insulin, the test strips, the doctor's appointments, these cost money the family simply didn't have. Insurance gaps meant unexpected costs. Generic medications weren't always effective enough. And the complicated calculus of choosing between medication and food played out in their household monthly. Jennifer didn't know exactly how much the girls collected each evening. Grace and Emma would come home, dump the coins and bills onto the kitchen table, and meticulously count and organize everything. They'd separated their findings into 2 piles. One for immediate medicine costs, and one they'd been saving for months, hoping to have enough for a 3-month supply of insulin that their mother desperately needed. "How much tonight?" Jennifer asked one evening as her daughters returned home, their cheeks flushed from the cool air. Grace sorted through the change with practiced efficiency. $47.33. That's $218 for the week so far. Jennifer closed her eyes. $218. It was an extraordinary amount for her daughters to have collected through singing. It was also nowhere near enough for what their mother truly needed. The 3-month supply of insulin cost nearly $800, even through the discount programs she'd managed to find. "That's wonderful, girls," Jennifer said, her voice tight. "You did so well." What she didn't say was what every number represented. Every dollar was an hour of her children's childhood spent on a street corner instead of in a classroom, at a park, or simply being 8 and 11 years old. Every dollar was proof that the system had failed them so completely that children had become the primary breadwinners in their own family. Emma climbed onto the bed beside her mother, her small body curling against Jennifer's hip. "Mommy, can we get you more medicine now?" "Not yet, sweetheart. Jennifer said, running her fingers through her daughter's hair. But we're getting closer every day. What Jennifer didn't know was that their story was about to change. That same evening, a man named Thomas Bennett was sitting in his corner office on the 32nd floor of a building that overlooked the very street corner where Grace and Emma sang. Thomas Bennett was 53 years old and had built a real estate and investment empire over 3 decades. His net worth exceeded $800 million. He had penthouse apartments in 3 cities, a vacation home in the Caribbean, and a collection of luxury cars that most people would spend a lifetime earning. By every conventional measure, he was successful. By every measure that actually mattered to his own conscience, he felt empty. His marriage had ended 7 years ago. His children, now adults, called him on his birthday and Christmas, pleasant conversations that lasted exactly 15 minutes. He had colleagues but no real friends. He had money but no purpose. He spent his days in meetings about acquisitions and quarterly returns, and his nights alone in his penthouse, watching the city lights flicker below. That evening, he had stayed late at the office, going over financial projections that would make him even wealthier but somehow even more hollow. At 7:45 p.m., he stood at his floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the street below. That's when he heard it. The melody carried up through the canyon of buildings. Voices so clear and pure that they cut through the ambient noise of the city. Thomas leaned closer to the window, trying to identify the source. There, on the corner, he could see 2 small figures silhouetted against the streetlights. They were singing. Something about the sight pulled at him. He watched for several minutes as the girls performed their song. He could see people stopping, dropping money into what looked like a cardboard box, and moving on. But he could also see something else. He could see the way the smaller girl's body swayed with exhaustion, the way the older girl's arm never left her sister's shoulder, the way they sang as though their lives depended on it. Because Thomas would later learn, in some very real way, their lives did depend on it. He couldn't stop watching. When the girls finished their song, he watched them consult about something, then begin again, a different melody this time, something that sounded spiritual. Their voices rose and fell with such precision and emotion that Thomas felt something shift in his chest, something that had been locked away for years. When the girls finally packed up and disappeared into the darkness, Thomas remained at his window for another hour. He didn't return to his projections. He didn't check his emails or take calls. He simply stood there, thinking about what he'd witnessed. 2 children, singing on a street corner in the evening cold. Singing as though they had something important to say. Singing as though their very survival depended on the money they collected. Thomas had built his fortune by recognizing opportunity, by seeing potential where others saw obstacles. Now, looking down at that empty street corner, he recognized something different. He recognized a moment that would define what came next. The next morning, Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He would find out who those girls were. He would understand their story, and then he would figure out what it meant that they had moved him in a way nothing had moved him in years. Finding the girls took Thomas 3 days and the help of his personal assistant. He stationed himself near the corner on the following evening, waiting until 6 p.m. when Grace and Emma typically appeared. When they did, he watched them set up their makeshift stage. The same cardboard box, the same worn clothes, the same determined expressions on their young faces. This time, instead of retreating to his office window, Thomas approached them. Grace's eyes widened with caution as this well-dressed stranger in an expensive coat walked toward them. Her arm immediately went around Emma's shoulders, pulling her sister closer. Thomas recognized the gesture instantly. It was the same protective stance he'd seen from his window, repeated night after night. "Hello," Thomas said gently, keeping his voice soft and his distance respectful. "I live in that building over there." He gestured to the office tower. "I heard you singing last night from my window. I wanted to tell you that your voices are remarkable." Grace didn't relax. "Thank you," she said carefully, her eyes scanning him for threat. "Are you going to call someone? Tell us we can't be here." The question hit Thomas like a punch. This child's first assumption when approached by an adult was that she would be reported, removed, stopped. That told him everything about her life so far. "No," Thomas said. I'm not going to call anyone, but I would like to understand what you're doing. Why are you singing here every evening? Grace looked at Emma, seemed to make a calculation, and then answered with the directness of a child who has learned that honesty is sometimes the only survival strategy. My mom is sick. She has diabetes. Costs a lot of money for her medicine, and we don't have enough. So we sing for change. The simplicity of the explanation was devastating. Thomas felt something catch in his throat. How long have you been doing this? He asked. Since July, Emma said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken. That's 3 months. 3 months. Every evening for 90 nights, these children had stood on the street corner and sung while people hurried past. 3 months of collected change that would equate to maybe $600 or $700, a fraction of what a child's mother needed to survive. What's your name? Thomas asked Grace. Grace, this is my sister Emma, and our mom is Jennifer. I'm Thomas. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Would you be willing to tell me more about your mother's situation? Not right now. I don't want to disrupt your evening, but perhaps tomorrow, during the day. Grace's protective instincts were clearly warring with something else, the desperate hope that an adult with resources might actually help. Why do you want to know? She asked. Because, Thomas said, I think your story matters, and I think I might be able to help. But first, I need to understand what you're facing. The next afternoon, Thomas sat across from Jennifer Foster in her modest apartment. What he saw shocked him, not because poverty was unfamiliar to him in the abstract, but because it was so physically present in this small space. The furniture was old but meticulously maintained. There was barely any food in the kitchen. Medical supplies were organized with desperate precision on a shelf in the bedroom. Jennifer was nervous and clearly embarrassed. She kept apologizing for the state of the apartment, for the fact that she didn't have proper tea or coffee to offer him, for the fact that her daughters were forced to work on the streets. I never wanted this, Jennifer said, her voice breaking. I was a nurse. I worked hard. I paid my taxes. And then my husband left, and I got sick. And suddenly I'm 42 years old and my children are singing for my medicine. Thomas listened as Jennifer explained the specifics of her situation. Her disability payments were $1,200 a month. Rent was $800. Utilities, food, basic necessities took the rest. Her insulin alone cost $300 per month, and that was with discount programs and generic brands. One unexpected medical bill could bankrupt them entirely. The girls want me to go to the hospital, Jennifer said. But I'm terrified. If I can't work, and I already can't, then what? I'm afraid they'll take the girls and put them in the system. I'm afraid the state will decide I can't care for them. At least right now, we're together. This fear, that seeking help would result in losing her children, was keeping Jennifer from accessing care she desperately needed. It was a trap, Thomas realized, designed perfectly by a system that punished people for being poor and sick. Over the following week, Thomas took action. He hired a healthcare consultant who specialized in navigating insurance and medical assistance programs. They discovered that Jennifer qualified for expanded Medicaid coverage that she didn't know about. They found pharmaceutical assistance programs that would reduce her insulin costs to nearly nothing. They identified free or low-cost clinics where she could receive preventative care without the risk of catastrophic medical debt. But more importantly, Thomas brought in Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, an endocrinologist he knew personally who agreed to see Jennifer as a patient pro bono. During Jennifer's first appointment, conducted at the medical office with Thomas's encouragement and support, Dr. Okonkwo was direct but compassionate. Your blood sugar levels are dangerously unstable, Dr. Okonkwo told her. You're managing too little insulin because of cost. I'm concerned about your long-term complications. But the good news is that we now have options. You're not going to have to choose between medication and food anymore. Jennifer wept during that appointment. Grace and Emma, sitting in the waiting room, could hear their mother crying and rushed in, panicking that something was wrong. Instead, they found her crying with relief, the kind of tears that come when an impossible burden suddenly feels slightly less impossible. That evening, Thomas took all three of them to dinner at a simple restaurant near their apartment. It wasn't fancy, but it was warm and welcoming. He watched as Grace and Emma examined the full menu, not looking at prices, something Thomas realized they'd been doing their entire lives, and ordered real meals instead of the cheapest options. "You don't have to sing on the street anymore," Thomas told them gently. "Your mom is going to be okay. It's going to take some time, but she's going to be okay." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Really? For real? For real?" Thomas confirmed. Grace, who had been the protector and provider for so long, simply held her mother's hand and didn't speak. But her shoulders, which had carried so much weight, seemed to drop slightly lower, as if the burden had finally become bearable. That night, Thomas made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. He realized that while he had solved this one family's crisis through individual charity, he had not solved the system that had created it. Hundreds of thousands of families were in similar situations. Millions of children were facing adult responsibilities because of healthcare costs, wage stagnation, and systemic failure. The question wasn't just, how do I help Grace, Emma, and Jennifer? The question was, how do I make sure that no other children have to sing on a street corner to buy their mother's medicine? And that question was going to require much more than money. It was going to require exposure, accountability, and a willingness to challenge the systems that had allowed such a situation to exist in the first place. Thomas Bennett had spent 30 years in the business world learning how to build cases. He understood evidence, documentation, and the power of data to shift perception. Now, for the first time, he was going to use these skills for something that mattered beyond quarterly earnings. He hired an investigative journalist named Marcus Chen, someone he'd met years ago at a charity event and had always respected. Marcus had spent 15 years exposing systemic corruption and institutional failure. When Thomas called him with the story of Grace, Emma, and Jennifer, Marcus's response was immediate. "This is big," Marcus said over coffee at Thomas's office. "But it's not new. It's just usually invisible. Let me show you." Over the following weeks, Marcus compiled data that painted a devastating picture. In the city alone, over 2.3 million people skipped or rationed medications due to cost. Families were choosing between insulin and rent at a rate of 1 in 12. Children were working formally or informally to support family medical expenses in roughly 1 in 20 households. The numbers were staggering, and they were all hidden behind the closed doors of apartments and hospitals and doctors' offices. But Grace and Emma's story was different. It was visible. It was public. It was impossible to ignore once people knew about it. Thomas also brought in Dr. James Morrison, a healthcare economist who had been studying medication costs and access disparities for 2 decades. Dr. Morrison reviewed Jennifer's case file and was blunt about what he saw. "This woman is a cautionary tale of how the system actively punishes people for being sick and poor," Dr. Morrison said. "She qualifies for help, but the bureaucratic barriers are so high that most people never find it. She was 1 month away from a diabetic crisis that would have landed her in the emergency room, racking up tens of thousands of dollars in debt she could never pay. And her daughters would have ended up in the foster system." Thomas also contacted Rebecca Washington, a lawyer who specialized in healthcare rights and patient advocacy. Rebecca had spent years fighting pharmaceutical companies and insurance corporations. She saw in Thomas's story something she'd been waiting for. A case that was sympathetic, compelling, and systemic all at once. "We need to document everything," Rebecca said, spreading files across Thomas's conference table. Jennifer's medical records, the cost of her medications, the assistance programs she should have qualified for but didn't know about, the impact on her children. "We need to show that this isn't a one-off case. It's a pattern that the system creates and perpetuates." Meanwhile, Grace and Emma were experiencing their own transformation. For the first time in months, they weren't spending their evenings on the street corner. Instead, they were going to school, doing homework, and playing with other children. Emma had started seeing a school counselor to process the trauma of adult responsibilities placed on a child. Grace was slowly learning that her value wasn't determined by how much money she could earn for her family. But they were also becoming increasingly aware that their story was being used to illustrate something larger. Thomas had asked their permission before involving them in his documentation process, and both girls, in their own ways, had understood that telling their story might help other families. If other kids don't have to sing for medicine, that's good, right? Emma had asked Thomas. Yes, Thomas confirmed. That's very good. The opposition emerged gradually but predictably. First came the pharmaceutical companies' lobbying firms, which sent legal letters warning Thomas about defamation if he made specific claims about pricing. Then came insurance industry representatives who questioned whether Jennifer had really exhausted all her options. There were whispers in business circles that Thomas was going soft, that he was being manipulated by a sob story, that he should focus on his actual business instead of crusades. Thomas received an email from one of his business partners that particularly stung. You've built an empire through smart decisions and ruthlessness. Don't throw it away by becoming a bleeding heart. But Thomas had learned something in the process of helping Jennifer and her daughters. The empire he had built was ultimately hollow. The ruthlessness that had served him well in real estate negotiations felt empty when applied to questions of human dignity. The first real blow came when one of Thomas's primary real estate investors, a powerful healthcare corporation, threatened to pull their funding from his developments if he continued to pursue this healthcare advocacy work. The message was clear. You can help individual families, but don't challenge the system that's making us rich. Thomas made his decision without hesitation. He released the investor's stake in his portfolio. It cost him approximately $40 million. He didn't announce it publicly. He simply accepted the loss and moved forward. What he did do was escalate the campaign. He worked with Marcus Chin to develop a documentary-style piece that told not just Grace and Emma's story, but the stories of 18 other families in similar situations. He funded research that Dr. James Morrison had been wanting to conduct for years, a comprehensive study of medication rationing in America. He worked with Rebecca Washington to file a lawsuit against 3 major insurance companies for denying coverage to eligible low-income patients. By late November, Thomas's campaign had a name: the Medicine Gap. The hashtag began trending on social media. News outlets that had previously ignored healthcare access stories suddenly became interested. Politicians started asking questions they'd been avoiding. Grace and Emma became the face of the movement, though Thomas was careful to manage their involvement. They did a careful interview with a sympathetic journalist. Nothing exploitative, nothing that put them in the position of performing their trauma. They simply told their truth. What it felt like to work as children, what it meant to finally have their mother healthy, what they hoped would change. That interview went viral. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 14 million times. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in for Jennifer's medical care, far more than she needed. Thousands of people shared their own stories of medication rationing. Healthcare workers came forward with testimonies about the gaps they witnessed daily. Patient advocacy groups that had been fighting for years suddenly had a platform and an audience. But with the visibility came increased pressure from corporate interests. Thomas began receiving death threats. There were investigations into his tax practices and business dealings, clearly retaliatory, clearly designed to discredit him. His name was dragged through multiple scandals that had nothing to do with his current work but were weaponized to undermine his credibility. Through it all, Thomas kept a framed drawing that Emma had made for him. It showed 3 stick figures, clearly meant to be Jennifer, Grace, and Emma, surrounded by musical notes. Below the drawing, Emma had written in careful letters, "Thank you for helping Mommy." It was his reminder of why this mattered. Not the money, not the publicity, not the political victory. It mattered because Jennifer could take her medication without fear. It mattered because Grace and Emma could be children again. On a cold December evening, Thomas sat with Jennifer, Grace, and Emma in their apartment. Jennifer was healthier than she'd been in years. Her medical care was now properly managed. Her insulin supply stable, her future less uncertain. The apartment still wasn't fancy, but it felt different now. Felt like a home, not a crisis. "What happens next?" Jennifer asked Thomas. "With everything you're doing?" "Next," Thomas said, "we make sure that what happened to you becomes impossible to ignore. We make sure that politicians have to respond. We make sure that corporations have to change their practices. We make sure that the system that almost destroyed your family gets held accountable. And if they don't listen? Emma asked quietly. Thomas looked at the girl who had sung for change on a street corner, who had carried adult responsibility on her small shoulders, who had somehow remained hopeful despite everything. Then we make sure they can't ignore us, he said, because your story is too important to ignore. And there are thousands of families with stories just like yours waiting to be heard. The battle ahead would be brutal. Thomas knew this. He also knew that this time he was fighting for something that mattered. The congressional hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early January. Thomas had been invited to testify before the House Committee on Healthcare Access and Affordability, alongside executives from 3 major pharmaceutical companies and 2 insurance industry representatives. The hearing room was packed. Journalists filled the gallery, advocates lined the benches, and cameras were positioned to capture every moment. Thomas sat at the witness table, a single microphone in front of him. He wore a simple dark suit, nothing that screamed wealth or power. He had learned that optics mattered. He had also learned that authenticity mattered more than optics. The committee chairman, Representative David Foster, opened with a question directed at Thomas. Mr. Bennett, you've spent the last 6 weeks very publicly advocating for changes to healthcare pricing and access. You've spent considerable personal resources on this campaign. Can you explain to this committee why a man in your position would risk so much for what some have called a political crusade? Thomas leaned toward the microphone. His voice was steady. I didn't start this as a political crusade. I started because I witnessed 2 children singing on a street corner to buy their mother's insulin. I started because I realized that in the wealthiest nation on earth, families are facing impossible choices between medication and survival. And I started because I realized that I had the resources to do something about it and the moral obligation to use them. The pharmaceutical executives shifted uncomfortably. They knew what was coming. The most critical moment came when Representative Maria Gonzalez asked the pharmaceutical representatives a direct question. Why does insulin cost 3 times as much in America as it does in Canada, when it's the exact same medication produced by the exact same companies? The industry representatives offered the standard responses. Research and development costs, regulatory compliance, market competition. The explanations sounded hollow in the face of the documented evidence that Dr. James Morrison had presented earlier in the hearing. Evidence showing that pharmaceutical companies were spending twice as much on marketing as on actual research. Then Representative Gonzalez did something unexpected. She called Grace and Emma as witnesses. Grace walked to the witness table with her sister. Both girls wore simple, respectful clothing. Neither looked frightened, exactly, but both carried the weight of understanding that their words would be heard by millions. The chairman asked Grace a simple question. Can you tell this committee about your experience over the last 6 months? Grace's voice was clear and measured. My mom got sick with diabetes. We didn't have money for her medicine. So Emma and I would sing on the street corner every evening to collect money. We did that for 3 months. During that time, my mom wasn't getting all the medicine she needed because we couldn't earn enough money. She was getting sicker. Emma added quietly, I was 8 years old. I should have been at home doing homework or playing with my friends. Instead, I was working to help pay for medicine. The silence in the hearing room was absolute. Even the pharmaceutical executives' lawyers weren't spinning or counter-messaging. There was no defense for children having to work to keep their mother alive. Representative Gonzalez pressed further. Grace, if you had to go back and sing on that corner today, what would you want to say to the people making decisions about medication prices? Grace looked directly at the cameras. I would ask them to imagine their own children having to do what we did. I would ask them to think about how that feels. And then I would ask them why they think it's okay. The hearing continued for 6 more hours. Rebecca Washington presented the legal case for price regulation and transparency. Marcus Chin presented the investigative findings showing coordinated price fixing among major pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Morrison presented research data on medication rationing across the country. But it was Grace and Emma's testimony that broke through the noise. By the time the hearing adjourned, #MedicineGap was trending globally. News outlets that had been skeptical of Thomas's campaign were now calling it a civil rights issue. Politicians who had remained silent were suddenly issuing statements supporting healthcare reform. The pharmaceutical companies and insurance industry did what they had always done when faced with public pressure. They hired more lobbyists, launched more counter-messaging campaigns, and began preparing their defense against regulatory changes. But something had shifted. The invisible had become visible. The system that had been hidden behind bureaucratic language and corporate jargon now had faces: two young girls and their mother. Thomas received a call from the president's chief of staff that evening. The administration was launching a comprehensive review of medication pricing practices. They wanted Thomas to serve on the advisory committee. More importantly, they wanted the momentum that his campaign had created to translate into actual legislative change. Over the following weeks, Thomas worked with legislative staff to draft comprehensive healthcare reform. The proposed legislation, eventually called the Medicine Access and Affordability Act, included provisions for price transparency requirements for all medications, regulations on price increases above inflation, expansion of medication assistance programs, criminal penalties for price fixing, investment in generic medication production. The pharmaceutical and insurance industries fought back hard. There were attack ads questioning Thomas's motives. There were studies commissioned to undermine Dr. Morrison's research. There was pressure on politicians to abandon the initiative. But Jennifer Foster, now healthy, now stable, now functioning as an advocate in her own right, began doing something powerful. She told her story, not just once but repeatedly, in town halls, in interviews, in written testimony. She described what it felt like to choose between medication and food. She described the terror of wondering if she would survive long enough to see her daughters graduate high school. She described the moment when someone with resources and conscience decided to help, and more importantly, decided to change the system that had created her crisis. "I'm not special," Jennifer said at one public forum. "I did everything right. I worked hard. I paid my taxes. I worked in healthcare. And the system still broke me. That tells you something about the system, not about me." The message resonated. Families across the country began sharing their own stories. Healthcare workers testified about rationing decisions they were forced to make. Doctors spoke about the moral injury of being unable to prescribe necessary medications because of cost. Patient advocacy groups that had been fighting for decades suddenly had political momentum on their side. By late February, the Medicine Access and Affordability Act had sufficient co-sponsors to move to a floor vote. The vote was scheduled for mid-March. The week before the vote, Thomas received an unexpected letter. It was from one of the pharmaceutical executives he had testified against, a man named Richard Caldwell who had spent 40 years in the industry. Caldwell wrote, "I've been thinking about what those girls said in the hearing. I have grandchildren. I imagine them singing on a street corner, and I couldn't defend that. I'm retiring from my position at the company. I'm also going to support the legislation." The letter was private, not a public statement. Caldwell didn't want credit or acknowledgement. He simply wanted to stop participating in a system he had come to recognize as fundamentally broken. By the time the vote happened on March 15th, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Medicine Access and Affordability Act passed with overwhelming bipartisan support, 312 votes in favor, 123 opposed. When Thomas heard the result, he thought of Grace singing on a street corner. He thought of Emma's small voice in the hearing room. He thought of Jennifer's courage in sharing her story. And he understood that this victory wasn't his. It belonged to every person who had experienced the invisible crisis and found the courage to speak it into visibility. The morning after the vote, Grace woke to find herself on the front page of every major newspaper. Headlines read, "Children's Voices Change History," and "How Two Sisters Transformed Healthcare." There were photographs of her and Emma from the hearing, their young faces serious and determined. The sudden attention was disorienting. Grace was 12 years old. She had been plucked from invisibility and placed squarely in the center of a national narrative she hadn't sought out. Emma, at 9, was still processing what had happened. She asked her mother repeatedly, "Is it over now? Can we go back to normal?" The answer was complicated. Yes, it was over in one sense, the legislation had passed. But in another sense, it was just beginning. Implementation of the Medicine Access and Affordability Act would take months. There would be regulatory frameworks to establish, enforcement mechanisms to create, and corporate resistance to navigate. But for Jennifer, Grace, and Emma personally, change was immediate and tangible. Jennifer's medical care transformed. Under the new legislation's provisions, her insulin costs dropped from $300 per month to $45. Medications that had previously been too expensive suddenly became accessible. Her blood sugar levels stabilized. The constant anxiety about whether she would have enough medication evaporated. For the first time in years, Jennifer could breathe. "I stopped having nightmares about medical bills," Jennifer said one evening, sitting with Thomas in her apartment. "That might sound small, but it's enormous. I can sleep through the night now without waking up in a panic." The changes in Grace and Emma were equally profound but manifested differently. Emma started 4th grade without the burden of having to work evenings. She joined the school choir, not because she needed to sing for survival, but because she wanted to. The experience of singing became joyful rather than transactional. Grace entered middle school with time and energy to focus on academics. Her grades improved rapidly. She had always been intelligent, but her intelligence had been channeled entirely into survival planning. Figuring out schedules, managing money, protecting her family. Now that intelligence could be directed toward learning, toward growth, toward imagining a future beyond immediate crisis. But both girls carried something that couldn't be erased by legislation. Emma had anxiety about money that made her reluctant to spend anything unnecessary, even when it was appropriate to do so. Grace struggled with the guilt of rest, the feeling that she was being irresponsible by not constantly doing something to help her family. Dr. Sarah Chun, a child psychologist who had been brought in to support the family, worked with both girls on processing their trauma. "What happened to you was real," Dr. Chun told them. "The crisis was real. Your response was appropriate for the situation you were in. But now that the situation has changed, your nervous systems need to learn that it's safe to relax." The process was slow and non-linear. There were days when Emma felt like her old self, playing, laughing, being a child. There were other days when she retreated into fear and scarcity thinking. Grace alternated between excitement about her future and overwhelming guilt about having a future when so many children didn't. Thomas became a regular presence in their lives, though in a different capacity now. He wasn't the billionaire savior figure anymore. He was something more complicated. A friend, a mentor, someone who had taken enormous risks because he believed their story mattered. "Why did you help us?" Emma asked Thomas one afternoon while they were making cookies in the apartment kitchen. Thomas paused, considering the question seriously. "Because when I saw you singing on that corner, I realized I had been spending my life building things that didn't matter. And I realized I had the power to help you, and I couldn't ignore that. But more importantly, helping you led me to understand that the system was broken. And fixing the system mattered more than helping just one family." "But you did help just one family," Emma pointed out. "Our family." "I did," Thomas agreed. "And I'm glad. But now thousands of families are being helped because we didn't stop with just helping yours." The legislative victory, while substantial, also revealed how much work remained. Implementation revealed gaps in the new law. Pharmaceutical companies found loopholes. Some states moved slowly to enforce the new requirements. Dr. Morrison's ongoing research showed that while medication access had improved dramatically, other barriers remained: transportation, childcare, documentation requirements that created obstacles for vulnerable populations. Jennifer, now healthier and with more stability, began advocating for further reforms. She joined patient advocacy groups. She spoke at healthcare forums. She testified before state legislatures about the gaps she was observing. "I didn't intend to become an advocate," Jennifer said at one public event. "I just wanted my children to not have to work for their mother's medicine. But I realized that fixing that required changing the entire system. Now that I've seen what change looks like, I can't stop pushing for more." Grace's relationship with singing transformed dramatically. She joined her school's music program and discovered that she loved music for its own sake, not as a survival mechanism. Her voice had matured slightly, deepened, and become more controlled. When she sang now, it was with joy rather than desperation. One evening, she asked if she could sing the national anthem at a healthcare reform rally that was happening in the city. Her request was approved, and on a cold April afternoon, Grace stood on a stage and sang the Star-Spangled Banner to a crowd of thousands. When she finished, the crowd erupted in tears and applause. After the rally, a music teacher approached Grace and offered her a full scholarship to a prestigious arts academy. "Your voice is special," the teacher said. "But more than that, your story is special. I want to help you develop your talent so you can tell that story through music for years to come." Grace accepted the scholarship. For the first time, her future included possibility rather than just survival. By summer, the Bennett Foster family, a label that had emerged unofficially but felt accurate, had settled into a new rhythm. Jennifer was working part-time in a healthcare administrative role. Not the nursing she had done before, but meaningful work that felt sustainable. Grace was preparing for music academy. Emma was being a normal 9-year-old. Playing with friends, worrying about school projects, enjoying childhood. The apartment had transformed too. There were fresh flowers on the kitchen table. Books lined the shelves. Not just textbooks, but novels, poetry, stories. The walls held artwork that Emma had created in art class. The refrigerator displayed report cards showing Grace and Emma's excellent grades. It was a modest apartment in a modest neighborhood. By the standards of Thomas's penthouse or corporate boardrooms, it was humble. But by the standards of safety, stability, and possibility, it was extraordinary. "Do you ever miss the street corner?" Thomas asked Grace one afternoon. "Not even a little bit," Grace said immediately. Then she reconsidered. "Actually, that's not true. I miss it in one way. I miss knowing exactly what my life was for. My purpose was clear: earn money so my mom could have medicine. Now I have all these possibilities, and it's kind of overwhelming. But no, I would never go back. I just wouldn't trade places with anyone who's still there." "Still where?" Thomas asked. "Singing for survival," Grace said. "Working when they should be in school. Carrying adult responsibilities on kids' shoulders. That's still happening for other families. That's what scares me." It was a mature observation from a 12-year-old. It was also an indication that the work wasn't done. The legislation had addressed pricing and access, but the underlying economic inequality remained. There were still families making impossible choices. There were still children working. There were still people falling through the gaps of the system. Thomas and Dr. Morrison had already begun talking about what came next. They were developing research on housing insecurity and its relationship to health outcomes. They were working with patient advocacy groups to identify other systemic barriers. They were thinking long-term about how to create the kind of comprehensive social safety net that would prevent future crises like Jennifer's. But for now, in this moment, Thomas allowed himself to simply observe this family that had changed his life. He saw Jennifer healthy and purposeful. He saw Grace contemplating her future in music with genuine possibility. He saw Emma being a child, which was exactly what she should be. And he understood that this was the real victory, not the legislation, though that mattered. The real victory was this: a mother and her daughters were no longer in crisis. They had time, safety, and possibility. And because they had those things, they could now help create them for others. 2 years had passed. Grace was 14 now, a freshman in the prestigious Arts Academy on a full scholarship. Her voice had developed into something remarkable, not just technically proficient, but emotionally intelligent in a way that suggested she understood something about human suffering that gave her music depth. She was performing in her school's production of Porgy and Bess, a role that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago when she was singing for change on a street corner. Emma was 11, in 6th grade, thriving in ways that made everyone around her smile. The anxiety about money had decreased substantially, though it hadn't entirely disappeared. She would likely carry some version of that trauma forever, the understanding that safety could be fragile, that circumstances could change. But she was no longer controlled by it. She was learning an instrument, developing her own musical interests independent of her sister's path, and occasionally, she laughed with the unself-consciousness of childhood. Jennifer had changed most dramatically of all. She had returned to full-time work as a healthcare administrator, using her nursing background to help implement the new medication access protocols. She wasn't wealthy, and she likely never would be. But she had security. She had a future that wasn't constrained by immediate crisis. She had reclaimed her identity as something other than a desperate mother. The Medicine Access and Affordability Act had been in effect for nearly 18 months. The results were documented in extensive research. Medication rationing had decreased by 67% among low-income populations. Emergency room visits related to untreated chronic conditions had dropped by 43%. Most significantly, pediatric medication rationing, children not receiving necessary medications due to cost, had nearly been eliminated. But the law's impact extended beyond statistics. It had shifted something in the national consciousness. Healthcare was no longer primarily framed as a consumer good or a market commodity. It was being discussed as a fundamental right. Politicians who had previously avoided healthcare reform were now supporting it. Corporations were being held accountable for pricing practices. The invisible crisis had become visible, and visibility had created pressure for change. Dr. James Morrison's research had evolved. He was now leading a comprehensive study on the relationship between economic insecurity and health outcomes, work that would eventually shape healthcare policy for years to come. His research documented something that should have been obvious but had been ignored. When people are terrified about survival, their bodies respond with chronic stress that worsens health outcomes. The system that had been forcing Jennifer into crisis was actively harming her health. Breaking the cycle of crisis improved not just her medication access, but her entire physiological functioning. Marcus Chin, the investigative journalist, had won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on medication pricing and corporate coordination. His work had exposed systematic price fixing and had led to criminal investigations against 3 major pharmaceutical executives. The visibility had led to accountability. Rebecca Washington's healthcare rights organization had expanded significantly. Using funding that Thomas had provided, she had opened offices in 5 states. Her lawyers were successfully challenging insurance company denials at a rate of 78%, recovering millions in improperly denied coverage. Thomas himself had undergone a transformation that he occasionally struggled to explain. He had gradually transitioned out of real estate development. His company was sold to a consortium of his former partners. The sale made him even wealthier. Real estate always did, but wealth no longer felt like the measure of success. Now he worked primarily through his newly established Bennett Foundation for Healthcare Equity. The foundation had invested in research, advocacy, policy development, and direct support for families still experiencing medication access crises. He had given away approximately $200 million over the past 2 years. He calculated that he had enough wealth to do this work for the rest of his life. "I used to think I was successful because I built an empire," Thomas said in an interview 18 months after the vote. "Now I realize I was wasting my life. The empire was hollow. This work, fighting for healthcare justice, supporting families like Jennifer's, pushing for systemic change. This is what success actually looks like." But perhaps the most profound transformation was cultural. Grace and Emma had become symbols, not in a manipulative way but organically. Children across the country had started singing the Medicine Song, an original composition by Grace that captured the crisis and the possibility of change. The song had been recorded and the proceeds donated to medication access programs. It had been performed at rallies, at schools, at healthcare conferences. Grace hadn't set out to become a symbol. She had simply wanted to process her experience through music. But in doing so, she had given voice to thousands of families who had previously been silent. One afternoon, Thomas received a letter from a woman named Patricia Martinez. She wrote, "My daughter heard Grace's song on the radio. She asked me why I wasn't getting my arthritis medication. I had been rationing because of the cost, and I hadn't told anyone because I was ashamed. But hearing about Grace made me realize I didn't have to be ashamed of a system that failed me. I went to a clinic using the resources your foundation provides, and I'm now receiving the medication I need. Thank you for making it possible for me to tell my story. The letter was one of thousands. The impact of visibility had rippled far beyond the Foster family. People who had been silent about their crises were now speaking. People who had been ashamed were reclaiming their dignity. People who had accepted their suffering as inevitable were beginning to believe that change was possible. Jennifer gave a keynote address at a national healthcare conference 2 years after the congressional hearing. She stood at the podium and spoke directly to the audience of healthcare professionals, administrators, and policymakers. I want to talk about what it feels like to be failed by a system you trusted, Jennifer said. I worked in healthcare. I paid my taxes. I did everything right. And when I got sick, the system broke me. My daughters had to work to keep me alive. That shouldn't be normal. That shouldn't be acceptable. And because of the people in this room who decided it wasn't acceptable anymore, it's changing. She paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. But I also want to say something to those of you who are still defending the old system. I understand why you do it. I understand that systems are powerful and change is difficult, and sometimes it feels like the individual cost is too high. But I'm here to tell you that the cost of maintaining this system is paid by people like me and my daughters. It's paid by children who should be in school instead of working. It's paid by sick people who have to choose between medicine and food. It's paid in suffering and loss and wasted potential. So I'm asking you, begging you to choose differently. The speech was broadcast widely. It catalyzed another round of healthcare reform discussions. It led to expansion of the Medicine Access and Affordability Act in 3 additional states. But perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated something crucial. The people most affected by broken systems often have the clearest vision of what needs to change. Jennifer hadn't needed policy experts or healthcare economists to understand that the system was broken. She had needed safety and stability long enough to find her voice. Thomas and Jennifer had become genuine friends over the 2 years. They met regularly, not as billionaire and beneficiary, but as 2 people who had been changed by their encounter with each other's humanity. Their conversations ranged from personal reflections to strategic planning about healthcare reform. I keep thinking about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped to listen, Jennifer said one evening. I keep thinking about what would have happened if I had just given you money and moved on, Thomas replied. I would have felt good about myself for a while, but nothing would have changed for anyone else. Is that why you did it? Jennifer asked. For systemic change? I did it because I couldn't ignore you and your daughters, Thomas said honestly. But I kept doing it because I realized that individual charity wasn't enough. That invisible crises have to become visible. That systems that hide behind bureaucracy and corporate language have to be exposed. That people have to understand that what happened to your family could happen to them, and that when it does, they deserve better. Grace stood on a stage at her school's spring concert, preparing to perform a solo she had composed. The piece was called Mercy, and it was a meditation on crisis, survival, and the possibility of transformation. It incorporated elements of the spirituals that had sustained her ancestors, woven together with contemporary musical language. When she finished, there was absolute silence. Then the audience rose to its feet, applauding with the kind of intensity that suggested something larger than appreciation for a musical performance. They were acknowledging witnessing something true. After the concert, an older woman approached Grace. She was in her 70s, with gray hair and kind eyes. I heard you sing at the congressional hearing, the woman said. I was a pharmaceutical lobbyist for 35 years. I spent my career defending pricing practices that I now recognize were indefensible. Hearing you sing, especially this piece, made me understand the human cost of the work I did. I'm retiring. I'm going to spend my remaining years trying to undo some of that damage. Grace didn't know what to say. She simply hugged the woman, understanding instinctively that transformation, even late in life, was precious and worthy of recognition. 3 years after the congressional hearing, Thomas commissioned a documentary about the medicine gap movement. It was called The Cost of Silence, and it told not just Grace and Emma's story, but the stories of 42 other families who had been transformed by the legislative changes. It premiered at a major film festival and was later broadcast on public television. In the final scene, Grace, Emma, and Jennifer stood together on the street corner where Grace and Emma had sung for change. They didn't sing. The filmmaker wanted this to be a moment of reflection rather than performance. They simply stood there, looking at each other and then at the camera. "We're not special," Jennifer said. "We're not unique. Our story is just one of thousands. The difference is that our story became visible. And when it became visible, people couldn't ignore it anymore." "Lots of kids are still singing for medicine," Emma added quietly. "The law helped a lot of people, but it didn't fix everything. There's still work to do." Grace looked directly at the camera. "I'm grateful for what changed. I'm grateful that my mom is healthy and my sister gets to be a kid. But I'm not forgetting what it felt like to have to earn survival. I'm going to keep using my voice to speak for people who don't have anyone listening yet." As the documentary ended, the screen faded to black and text appeared. The Medicine Access and Affordability Act has improved medication access for 4.2 million Americans. Healthcare reform remains one of the highest priorities for advocacy groups nationwide. Systemic change is ongoing. But underneath the statistics was a more fundamental truth. When invisible crises become visible, when individual stories illuminate systemic failure, when people with resources and conscience decide to act, transformation becomes possible. Grace, Emma, and Jennifer had not solved the crisis of healthcare inequality in America, but they had helped expose it. And in exposing it, they had changed the trajectory of thousands of lives, including their own. Thomas Bennett had not found meaning through wealth. He had found it through witness, through solidarity, through choosing to risk his empire for something that mattered more. And in doing so, he had discovered that the real measure of a life isn't how much you accumulate, but how much you contribute to the liberation of others. The song that Grace had sung on a street corner had been about survival. The song she now composed was about transformation. And somewhere in the gap between those two songs lay the space where systemic change had become possible, not through revolution, but through visibility. Not through force, but through witness. Not through charity, but through justice. The work continued. Families continued to face barriers. Systems continued to resist change. But something fundamental had shifted. The invisible had become visible. And once seen, it could never be unseen again.